Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama, Hare Hare. Reading from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 13. Om Agyantimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namah. Chapter 13. Nature, the Enjoyer and Consciousness. Text 1 and 2. Arjuna Vacha Prakritim Purusham Chaiva Kshetram Kshetrajnam Evacha Etad Vedutam Ichhami Jnanam Geyam Cha Keshava. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Idam Shariram Kaunteya Kshetram Mityabhidhiyate Etad Yo Veti Tam Prahu Kshetrajna Iti Tadvida. Translation. Arjuna said, "O my dear Krishna, I wish to know about Prakriti, nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, and the field and the knower of the field, and of knowledge and the object of knowledge." The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "This body, O son of Kunti, is called the field, and on one who knows this body is called the knower of the field." Purport. Arjuna was inquisitive about Prakriti, nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, Kshetra, the field, Kshetrajna, its knower, and knowledge and the object of knowledge. When he inquired about all these, Krishna said that this body is called the field, and that one who knows this body is called the knower of the field. This body is the field of activity for the conditioned soul. The conditioned soul is entrapped in material existence and he attempts to lord it over material nature. And so, according to his capacity to dominate material nature, he gets a field of activity. That field of activity is the body. And what is the body? The body is made of senses. The conditioned soul wants to enjoy sense gratification. And according to his capacity to enjoy sense gratification, he is offered a body or field of activity. Therefore, the body is called Kshetra or the field of activity for the conditioned soul. Now, the person who should not identify himself with the body is called Kshetrajna, the knower of the field. So, knower of the field is a person who does not identify himself with the body. That person can be called knower of the field. It is not very difficult to understand the difference between the field and its knower, the body and the knower of the body. Any person can consider that from childhood to old age, he undergoes so many changes of body and yet is still one person remaining. Thus, there is a difference between the knower of the field of activities and the actual field of activities. A living conditioned soul can thus understand that he is different from the body. It is described in the beginning, Dehinosmin, that the living entity is within the body and that the body changing from childhood to boyhood and from boyhood to youth and from youth to old age, and the person who owns the body knows that the body is changing. The owner is distinctly Kshetrajna. Sometimes we think, I am happy, I am a man, I am a woman, I am a dog, I am a cat. These are bodily designations of the knower, but the knower is different from the body. Although we may use many articles, our clothes, etc., we know that we are different from the things used. Similarly, we also understand by a little contemplation that we are different from the body. I or you or anyone else who owns the body is called Kshetrajna, the knower of the field of activities, and the body is called Kshetra, the field of activities itself. In the first 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita, the knower of the body, the living entity, and the position by which he can understand the Supreme Lord are described. In the middle 6 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the relationship between the individual soul and the super soul in regard to devotional service are described. The superior position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the subordinate position of the individual soul are definitely defined in these chapters. The living entities are subordinate under all circumstances, but in their forgetfulness they are suffering. When enlightened by pious activities, they approach the Supreme Lord in different capacities. As the distressed, those in want of money, the inquisitive, and those in search of knowledge. That is also described. Now, starting with the 13th chapter, how the living entity comes in contact with the material nature and how he is delivered by the Supreme Lord through the different methods of fruitive activities, cultivation of knowledge, and the discharge of devotional service are explained. Although the living entity is completely different from the material body, he somehow becomes related. This is also explained. Text 3. क्षेत्रज्ञ चापि मां विद्धि सर्वक्षेत्रेषु भारत क्षेत्रज्ञयोर्ज्ञानं यत्तज्ज्ञानं मतं मम. Translation. O Skian of Bharat, you should understand that I am also the knower in all bodies. And to understand this body and its knower is called knowledge. That is my opinion. Purport. While discussing the subject of the body and the knower of the body, the soul and the super soul, we shall find three different topics of study: the Lord, the living entity, and matter. In every field of activity, in everybody, there are two souls, the individual soul and the super soul. Because the super soul is the plenary expansion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna, Krishna says, I am also the knower. But I am not the individual knower of the body. I am the super knower. I am present in every body as the Paramatma or super soul. One who studies the subject matter of the field of activity and the knower of the field very minutely in terms of this Bhagavad Gita can attain to knowledge. The Lord says, I am the knower of the field of activities in every individual body. The individual may be knower of his own body, but he is not in knowledge of other bodies. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is present as the super soul in all bodies, knows everything about all bodies. He knows all different bodies of all the various species of life. A citizen may know everything about his patch of land, but the king knows not only his palace, but all the properties possessed by the individual citizens. Similarly, one may be the proprietor of the body individually, but the Supreme Lord is the proprietor of all bodies. The king is the original proprietor of the kingdom, and the citizen is the secondary proprietor. Similarly, the Supreme Lord is the supreme proprietor of all bodies. The body consists of the senses. The Supreme Lord is Rishikesh, which means the controller of the senses. He is the original controller of the senses. Just as the king is the original controller of all the activities of the state, the citizens are secondary controllers. The Lord says, I am also the knower. This means that he is the super knower. The individual soul knows only his particular body. In the Vedic literature, it is stated as follows. Kshetrani hi sharirani bijam chapi subha shubhe tani vetti sa yogatma tata kshetrajna uchyate. This body is called the Kshetra, and within it dwells the owner of the body. And the Supreme Lord, who knows both the body and the owner of the body, therefore, he is called the knower of all fields. The distinction between field of activities, the knower of activities, and the supreme knower of activities is described as follows. Perfect knowledge of the constitution of the body, the constitution of the individual soul, and the constitution of super soul is known in terms of Vedic literature as Jnana. That is the opinion of Krishna. To understand both the soul and the super soul as one, yet distinct, is knowledge. One who does not understand the field of activity and the knower of activity is not in perfect knowledge. One has to understand the position of Prakriti, nature, Purusha, the enjoyer of nature, and Ishvara, the knower who dominates or controls nature and the individual soul. One should not confuse the three in their different capacities. One should not confuse the painter, the painting, and the easel. This material world, which is the field of activities, is nature, and the enjoyer of nature is the living entity. And above them, both is the supreme controller, the personality of Godhead. It is stated in Vedic language in Shvetavatar Upanishad 1.12. Bhokta bhogyam preritaram chamaktva sarvam proktam trividham brahmam ittat. There are three Brahman conceptions. Prakriti is Brahman as the field of activities, and Jiva, individual soul, is also Brahman and is trying to control the material nature. And the controller of both of them is also Brahman, but he is the factual controller. In this chapter, it will also be explained that out of the two knowers, one is fallible and the other is infallible. One is superior and the other is subordinate. One who understands the two knowers of the field to be one and the same contradicts the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who states here very clearly, I am also the knower of the field of activity. One who misunderstands a rope to be a serpent is not in knowledge. There are different kinds of bodies and there are different owners of the bodies, because each individual soul has individual capacity for lording it over material nature. There are different bodies, but the Supreme also is present in them as the controller. The word cha is significant, for it indicates the total number of bodies. That is the opinion of Sri Baldev Vidya Bhushan. Krishna is the super soul present in each and every body apart from the individual soul. And Krishna explicitly says here that the real knowledge is to know that super soul is the controller of both the field of activities and the finite enjoyer. Verse 4. Tatshetram yaccha yadrikcha yadvikari yatascha yat sacha yo yat prabhavascha tat samasena meshrunu. Translation. Now, please hear my brief description of this field of activity and how it is constituted, what its changes are, whence it is produced, who that knower of the field of activities is, and what his influences are. Purport. The Lord is describing the field of activities and the knower of the field of activities in their constitutional positions. One has to know how this body is constituted, the materials of which this body is made, under whose control this body is working, how the changes are taking place, where from the changes are coming, what the causes are, what the reasons are, what the ultimate goal of individual soul is, and what the actual form of the individual soul is. One should also know the distinction between the individual living soul and the super soul, their different influences, their potentials, etc. One just has to understand this Bhagavad Gita directly from the description given by Supreme Personality of Godhead, and all this will be clarified. But one should be careful not to consider the Supreme Personality of Godhead in everybody to be one with the individual soul, the jiva. This is something like equating the potent and the impotent. Text 5. Rishibhir bahuda gitam chandobhir vividhe prathak brahma sutra padascheva hetumadbhir vinishchitaha. Translation. That knowledge of the field of activities and of the knower of activities is described by various sages in various Vedic writings. It is especially presented in Vedanta Sutra with all reasoning as to cause and effect. Purport. The Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna is the highest authority in explaining this knowledge. Still, as a matter of course, learned scholars and standard authorities always give evidence from previous authorities. Krishna is explaining this most controversial point regarding the duality and non-duality of the soul and the super soul by referring to a scripture, the Vedanta, which is accepted as authority. First, he says this is according to different sages. As far as the sages are concerned, beside himself, Vyasdev, the author of Vedanta Sutra, is a great sage, and in the Vedanta Sutra, duality is perfectly explained. And Vyasdev's father, Parashar, is also a great sage, and he writes in his books of religiosity, Aham Tvam Cha Tathanya. We, you, I, and the various other living entities are all transcendental, although in material bodies. Now we are fallen into the ways of the three modes of material nature according to our different karma. As such, some are on higher levels and some are in the lower nature. The higher and lower natures exist due to ignorance and are being manifested in an infinite number of living entities. But the super soul, which is infallible, is contaminated by three qualities of nature and is transcendental. Similarly, in the original Vedas, a distinction between the soul, the super soul, and the body is made, especially in Katha Upanishad. There are many great sages who have explained this, and Parashar is considered principal among them. The word Chandobhi refers to the various Vedic literatures. The Taittiriya Upanishad, for example, which is a branch of Yajurveda, describes nature, the living entity, and the Supreme Personality of Godhead. As stated before, Kshetra is the field of activities, and there are two kinds of Kshetrajna, the individual living entity and the supreme living entity. As stated in the Taittiriya Upanishad, Brahmapucham Pratishtha, there is a manifestation of the Supreme Lord's energy known as the Annamaya, dependence upon food for existence. This is a materialistic realization of the Supreme. Then in Pranamaya, after realizing the Supreme Absolute Truth in food, one can realize the absolute truth in the living symptoms or life forms. In Jnanamaya, the realization extends beyond the living symptoms to the point of thinking, feeling, and willing. Then there is Brahman realization called Vijnanamaya, in which the living entity's mind and life symptoms are distinguished from the living entity himself. The next and supreme stage is Anandamaya, realization of all blissful nature. Thus, there are 5 stages of Brahman realization which are called Brahmapucham. Out of these, the first three, Annamaya, Pranamaya, and Jnanamaya, involve the fields of activities of the living entities. Transcendental to all these fields of activities is the Supreme Lord, who is called Anandamaya. The Vedanta Sutra also describes the Supreme by saying Anandamayo Bhyasat. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is by nature full of joy. To enjoy his transcendental bliss, he expands into Vijnanamaya, Pranamaya, Jnanamaya, and Annamaya. In the field of activities, the living entity is considered to be the enjoyer, and different from him is Anandamaya. That means that if the living entity decides to enjoy and dovetailing himself with Anandamaya, then he becomes perfect. This is the real picture of the Supreme Lord as the supreme knower of the field, the living entity as a subordinate knower, and the nature of the fields of activities. One has to search for this truth in the Vedanta Sutra or Brahma Sutra. It is mentioned here that the codes of the Brahma Sutra are very nicely arranged according to cause and effects. Some of the sutras or aphorisms are Na Vishyad Ashruteha 2.3.2, Natma Shrute 2.3.18, and Paratu Tachyote 2.3.40. The first aphorism indicates the field of activities, the second indicates living entity, and the third indicates the Supreme Lord, the summum bonum among all manifestations across various entities. Text 6 and 7. Mahabhutanya ahankaro buddhira vyaktameva cha Indriyani dashekam cha panchachendriya gochara इच्छा द्वेषा सुखम दुःखम संघातश्चेतनाधृति एतत् क्षेत्रं समासेन साविकारम् उदाहरतम्. Translation: the five great elements, false ego, intelligence, and unmanifested, the 10 senses, and the mind, the five sense objects, desire, hatred, happiness, distress, the aggregate, the life symptom, and convictions. All these are considered, in summary, to be the field of activities and its interactions. Purport: from all the authoritative statements of the great sages, the Vedic hymns, and the aphorisms of the Vedanta Sutra, the components of this world can be understood as follows. First, there are earth, water, fire, air, and ether. These are five great elements called Mahabhuta. Then there are false ego, intelligence, and the unmanifested stage of the three modes of material nature. Then there are five senses for acquiring knowledge: the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin. Then five working senses: voice, legs, hands, anus, and genitals. Then above the senses, there is the mind, which is within and which can be called the sense within. Therefore, including the mind, there are 11 senses together. Then there are the five objects of the senses: smell, taste, form, touch, and sound. Now, the aggregate of these 24 elements is called the field of activity. If one makes an analytical study of these 24 subjects, then he can very well understand the field of activity. Then there are desire, hatred, happiness, and distress, which are interactions, representations of the five great elements in the gross body. The living symptoms represent by consciousness, and convictions are the main manifestation of the subtle body, mind, ego, and intelligence. These subtle elements are included within the field of activities. The five great elements are a gross representation of the false ego, which in turn represents the primal stage of false ego, technically called the materialistic conception or tamas buddhi, the intelligence in ignorance. This further represents the unmanifested stage of the three modes of material nature. The unmanifested modes of material nature are called pradhan. One who desires to know the 24 elements in detail, along with their interactions, should study the philosophy in more detail. In Bhagavad Gita, a summary alone is given. The body is the representation of all these factors, and there are changes of the body, which are 6 in number. The body is born, it grows, it stays. It produces byproducts, then it begins to decay, and at last stage, it vanishes. Therefore, the field is a non-permanent material thing. However, the Kshetrajna, the knower of the field, his proprietor, is different. Text 8 to 12. अमानित्वं वदम्भित्वम् अहिंसा शान्तिरार्जवम् आचार्योपासनं शौचं स्थैर्यम् आत्मा विनिग्रहः इन्द्रियार्थेषु वैराग्यम् अहङ्कार एव च जन्म मृत्यु जरा व्याधि दुःखदोषानुदर्शनम् असक्तिरनाभिष्वङ्ग पुत्रदारा गृहादिषु नित्यं च समचित्तत्वम् इष्टानि तु पपातिषु मयि चानन्ययोगेन भक्तिरव्याभिचारिणी विविक्तादेश सेवित्वम् अरतिर्ज्ञानसंशदि आध्यात्मज्ञाननित्यत्वं तत्त्वज्ञानार्थदर्शनम् एतज्ज्ञानमिति प्रोक्तम् अज्ञानं यद् अतोऽन्यथा. Translation: humility, pridelessness, non-violence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego, the perception of the evil of birth, death, old age, and disease, detachment, freedom from entanglement with children, wife, home, and the rest, even-mindedness amid pleasant and unpleasant events, constant and unalloyed devotion to me, aspiring to live in a solitary place, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization and philosophical search for the absolute truth. All these I declare to be knowledge. And besides this, whatever there may be, is ignorance. Purport. The process of knowledge is sometimes misunderstood by less intelligent men as being the interaction of the field of activity. But actually, this is the real process of knowledge. If one accepts this process, then the possibility of approaching the absolute truth exists. This is not the interaction of the 24 elements as described before. This is actually the means to get out of the entanglement of those elements. The embodied soul is entrapped by the body, which is casing made of 24 elements. And the process of knowledge as described here is the means to get out of it. Of all the descriptions of the process of knowledge, the most important point is described in the first line of the 11th verse. Mai chananya yogena bhaktir avyabhicharini. The process of knowledge terminates in unalloyed devotional service to the Lord. So if one does not approach or is not able to approach the transcendental service of the Lord, then the other 19 items are of no particular value. But if one takes to devotional service in full Krishna consciousness, the other 19 items automatically develop within him. As stated in Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 5, Chapter 18, verse 12, Yasya yasti bhaktir bhagvatya akinchana sarve gunesh tatra samasate suraha. All the good qualities of knowledge develop in one who has attained the stage of devotional service. The principle of accepting a spiritual master, as mentioned in the 18th verse, is essential. Even for one who takes to devotional service, it is most important. Transcendental life begins when one accepts a bona fide spiritual master. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Shri Krishna, clearly states here that this process of knowledge is the actual path. Anything speculated beyond this is nonsense. As for the knowledge outlined here, the items may be analyzed as follows. First, humility means that one should not be anxious to have the satisfaction of being honored by others. The material conception of life makes us very eager to receive honor from others. But from that point of view of a man in perfect knowledge, who knows that he is not this body? Anything, honor or dishonor, pertaining to this body is useless. One should not be hankering after this material deception. People are very anxious to be famous for their religion, and consequently, sometimes it is found that without understanding the principles of religion, one enters into some group which is not actually following the religious principles and then wants to advertise himself as a religious mentor. As for actual advancement in spiritual science, one should have a test to see how far he is progressing. He can judge by these items. Non-violence is generally taken to mean not killing or destroying the body. But actually, non-violence means not to put others in distress. People in general are trapped by ignorance in the material concept of life and they perpetually suffer material pains. So, unless one elevates people to spiritual knowledge, one is practicing violence. One should try his best to distribute real knowledge and to the people so that they may become enlightened and leave this material entanglement, that is non-violence. Tolerance means that one should be practiced to bear insult and dishonor from others. If one is engaged in advancement of spiritual knowledge, there will be so many insults and much dishonor from others. This is expected because material nature is so constituted. Even a boy like Prahlad, who only was 5 years old, was engaged in the cultivation of spiritual knowledge, was endangered by when his father became antagonist to his devotion. The father tried to kill him in so many ways. But Prahlad tolerated him. So there may be many impediments to making advancement in spiritual knowledge, but we should be tolerant and continue our progress with determination. Simplicity means that without diplomacy, one should be so straightforward that he can disclose the real truth even to an enemy. As for acceptance of the spiritual master, that is essential. Because without the instruction of a bona fide spiritual master, one cannot progress in the spiritual science. One should approach the spiritual master with all humility and offer him all services so that he will be pleased to bestow his blessings upon the disciple. Because a bona fide spiritual master is a representative of Krishna, if he bestows any blessings upon his disciple, that will make the disciple immediately advance without disciples following the regulative principles. Or the regulative principles will be easier for one who has served the spiritual master without reservation. Cleanliness is essential for making advancement in spiritual life. There are two kinds of cleanliness, external and internal. External cleanliness means taking bath, but for internal cleanliness, one has to think of Krishna. Always chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. This process cleans the accumulated dust of past karma from the mind. Steadiness means that one should be determined, very determined, to make progress in spiritual life. Without such determination, one cannot make tangible progress. And self control means that one should not accept anything which is detrimental to the path of spiritual progress. One should become accustomed to this and reject anything which is against the path of spiritual progress. This is real renunciation. These senses are so strong that they are always anxious to have sense gratification. One should not cater to these demands which are not necessary. The senses should only be gratified to keep the body fit so that one can discharge his duty in advancing in spiritual life. The most important and the uncontrollable sense is the tongue. If one can control the tongue, then there is every possibility of controlling the other senses. The function of the tongue is to taste and to vibrate. Therefore, by systematic regulation, the tongue should always be engaged in chanting, tasting the remnants of foodstuffs offered to Krishna, and chanting Hare Krishna. As far as the eyes are concerned, they should not be allowed to see anything but the beautiful form of Krishna. That will control the eyes. Similarly, the ears should be engaged in hearing about Krishna and the nose in smelling the flowers offered to Krishna. This is the process of devotional service, and it is understood here that Bhagavad Gita is simply expounding the science of devotional service. The devotional service is the main and sole objective. Unintelligent commentators on Bhagavad Gita try to divert the mind of the reader to other subjects, but there is no other subject in Bhagavad Gita than devotional service. False ego means accepting this body as oneself. When one understands that he is not this body and his spirit soul, he comes to his real ego. Ego is there. False ego is condemned, but not real ego. In the Vedic literature, Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad 1.4.10, it is said, Aham Brahmasmi. I am Brahman, I am spirit, this is I am, the sense of self, also exists in the liberated stage of self-realization. This sense of I am is ego, but when the sense of I am is applied to this false body, it is false ego. When the sense of self is applied to the reality, that is real ego. There are some philosophers who say we should give up our ego, but we cannot give up our ego because ego means identity. We ought, of course, to give up the false identification with the body. One should try to understand the distress of accepting birth, death, old age, and disease. There are descriptions in various Vedic literatures of birth. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, the world of the unborn, the child's stay in the womb of a mother, its suffering, etc., are all very graphically described. It should be thoroughly understood that the birth is distressful. Because we forget how much distress we have suffered within the womb of the mother, we do not make any solution to the repetition of birth and death. Similarly, at the time of death, there are all kinds of sufferings, and they are also mentioned in the authoritative scriptures. These should be discussed. And as far as disease and old age are concerned, everyone gets practical experience. No one wants to be diseased and no one wants to become old, but there is no avoiding these. Unless we have a pessimistic view of this material life, considering the distresses of birth, disease, old age, and death, there is no impetus for our making advancement in spiritual life. Okay, we'll stop at this point. where we'll continue for. As for detachment from children, wife, and home. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna.